The shortest war in history lasted only 38 minutes. On the morning of August 27, 1896, a war began. By the time most people would have finished their morning tea, it was already over. This is the story of the shortest war ever recorded in human history, a conflict so brief that some soldiers on the losing side may not have even realized it had started before it ended. This is the Anglo-Zanzibar War, and this is UNTOLDIA. To understand how a war could possibly end in under an hour, we need to go back to the political situation in Zanzibar in the late 19th century. Zanzibar, an island off the coast of East Africa, was at that time a British protectorate, meaning it retained its own sultan and local governance, but ultimately operated under significant British political influence and control. On August 25, 1896, the reigning sultan, Hamad bin Thuwaini, a ruler generally cooperative with British interests, died suddenly under circumstances some historical accounts suggest were suspicious, though never definitively proven. Within hours of his death, his cousin, Khalid bin Barghash, moved quickly and decisively, occupying the palace and declaring himself the new sultan without seeking the approval of British colonial authorities, a step that directly violated a treaty requiring British consent for any succession to the throne. British officials were, to put it mildly, furious. They viewed Khalid's actions as an unacceptable violation of their authority in the region and immediately demanded that he step down, vacate the palace, and allow a British-approved successor to take the throne instead. Khalid refused. Instead, he began fortifying the palace, gathering armed loyalists and preparing to defend his claim to the throne, drawing together a force of roughly 2,000 to 3,000 men, along with several artillery pieces positioned around the palace grounds and an old wooden ship anchored nearby. British authorities issued a final ultimatum. Khalid had until 9 a.m. on August 27th to surrender the palace peacefully. If he refused, British naval forces already positioned in the harbor would open fire. 9 a.m. came. Khalid did not surrender. At 9:02 a.m., British naval vessels opened fire on the palace. What followed was almost immediate and overwhelming devastation. The wooden palace structure, along with Khalid's makeshift naval defense, stood little chance against modern British naval artillery. Within minutes, the palace was engulfed in fire, its wooden structures collapsing under the bombardment. The small wooden vessel defending the harbor was sunk almost immediately. By 9:40 a.m., roughly 38 minutes after the first shot was fired, the bombardment ceased. Khalid's forces had been utterly defeated. The white flag was raised over what remained of the palace grounds. The war was over. Officially, it remains recorded as the shortest war in recorded history. The human cost, however, was far from insignificant. Historical estimates suggest as many as 500 people, primarily Zanzibari defenders and palace staff, were killed during the brief but intense bombardment, a devastating toll for a conflict that lasted less time than most people spend eating lunch. Khalid bin Barghash remarkably survived the attack. He managed to escape from the palace grounds during the chaos and sought refuge at the German consulate nearby, which, notably, was not under British jurisdiction. British forces reportedly surrounded the consulate for days, attempting to pressure German officials into handing him over, but Germany refused, citing diplomatic protections, eventually helping Khalid escape by ship to East African territory, well outside British reach. Following the swift defeat, British authorities quickly installed their preferred candidate, Hamad bin Muhammad, as the new sultan, who governed as a far more cooperative, largely ceremonial ruler firmly under British colonial oversight, effectively cementing British control over Zanzibar's governance for decades that followed. What makes this story so remarkable, even more than a century later, isn't simply its brevity, it's what it reveals about the sheer scale of colonial military power during this period. A conflict that many local Zanzibaris likely experienced as a devastating, life-altering catastrophe was, from the British military perspective, resolved so swiftly it barely registered as a full military engagement, a stark illustration of the vast imbalance in military capability between colonial powers and the territories they controlled during this era.
Today, the Anglo-Zanzibar War holds the Guinness World Record for shortest war in recorded history, a strange, almost darkly ironic historical footnote that behind that record lies real devastation, real lives lost, and a political struggle over sovereignty that was decided, quite literally, in less time than it takes to watch this video. So, the next time you hear about a war lasting years or even decades, remember, there was once a conflict that began and ended so quickly, some accounts suggest confusion still existed among certain defenders about whether the fighting had even started by the time it was already over. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. Subscribe to Untoldia for more stories history forgot to highlight. We'll see you in the next one.